your host. Well, I must admit, until a few months or so ago, I'd never heard of the Pilgrims Society. I'm very pleased to have here today Michael McKibben, who's an expert on the subject and where it may represent the greatest threat to the sovereignty of the United States. Michael, welcome. Please introduce us.
Great to be with you.
Introduce us to this sabotage society.
Well, it's hard to introduce this cold, so maybe a little bit of background would help. I'm an inventor. I'm an engineer. Entrepreneur, and in the mid-90s, I won the contract to rebuild AT&T's email system. And this was in time for Windows 95, if you recall that when that was introduced. And so I supported the entire world operation for AT&T internally and with all their major clients. And in the process of doing that, the internet was just starting to happen. And I put up one of the first 10 commercial websites that AT&T hosted. So I had a pretty good perspective on what was going on. And what I saw as an engineer was that all the major players, Microsoft, IBM, Novell, Lotus, were going down a path called groupware for internet collaboration. And I could see from working with AT&T Bell Labs that that was an incorrect approach. And so I put together a team. We went silent, raised my own money, managed my own design team, and we said, we're not coming out of this room, figuratively speaking, until we figured out what is wrong with large-scale collaboration. In 1999, we had the magic aha moment, and we realized we had something very special in an invention. So I went to Washington, and I looked for the most skilled patent attorney that we could find, and selected somebody called Professor James P. Chandler, who was advising Congress, the military, major corporations. And that was the good news. The bad news is Professor Chandler, as we have determined in the last few years, was an agent for the British Pilgrim Society. And who's ever heard of that? And what we discussed, it sounds like something Plymouth Rock or American Pilgrims, that kind of thing. But in fact, that was a very carefully chosen deception by the bankers of the City of London. And they specifically organized in 1902 to develop a new type of British Empire that would be run by corporations that would manage the army, the monarchy, and propaganda. And that was in 1902. And what I'm summarizing here, it took us over 10 years.
Cecil Rhodes.
Cecil Rhodes, was his brainchild from the late 1800s. And by 1992, he was a privy councillor for the Crown. And he, in 1889, he got a charter to start the British South Africa Company. And he teamed up with the likes of Cecil Rhodes and Warburg and Schiff and the Barclays and a number
Jews.
Pardon?
Jews.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting subject. I'll get back to that one.
Thank you.
So they basically began a trek to set up this one world government, and they actually called it that. Initially, they wanted to set up a white race government, and then they changed that to the English-speaking world government. And they started using their control of world banking to basically buy influence wherever they needed to buy it in order to set up the strategy. Started in 1902. That year, they also started coaching a guy by the name of Vladimir Lenin, who actually lived and worked in London and came there 6 times, and he was coached to be a Bolshevik and to go back and start communism. There's a relationship to Mao as well, but I won't get into that right now.
The Jews.
Yeah, there's a larger issue there. So we started looking at this Pilgrim Society, and what we realized that the general go-to historian that everybody quotes for this period of time was a Georgetown professor by the name of Carroll Quigley.
Right.
And he's written several books, The Anglo-American Establishment, and what's the other one? Tragedy and Hope. And what we've discovered over time is that Quigley wrote out from history any awareness of the Pilgrim Society, even though at the time in 1902, it was in all the newspapers. But since then, if you go to Quigley's books, the ones I just mentioned, and you type Pilgrim Society, there will be no search results. And then in 1909, they organized something called the First Imperial Press Conference in 1909. And we have an interesting story there because we started looking for any evidence of that particular conference in 1909, found nothing. And then somehow, I think sovereignly, we found a copy of their minutes in an offshore archive, an off-campus archive in a particular college in the Midwest. And there was a copy of this particular event, was well documented. And then what we started looking at in 1909, the Pilgrim Society, they were ready to get started with their organization. They brought in 650 newspapermen from around the world to come to London, and they were going to talk about how they were going to use newspapers to control their agenda. And it was organized by a guy by the name of W.T. Stead, who is now known as the father of tabloid journalism. And by the way, Quigley writes about none of this. And so what we learned from this conference is they were going to reorganize the empire around propaganda. And specifically at the end of this conference, they organized something called the Empire Press Union. And that was going to be the way they were going to disseminate one message throughout the world using the emerging wireless technology at the time. Actually, Marconi was a participant in this conference. And so they formed the Empire Press Union, which we know today popularly as Reuters and Associated Press. They were British control, are British control to this day. At the end of the conference, the participants, as they were going home, learned that the British Parliament was meeting, and the Prime Minister at the time, Asquith, started organizing what we now know as MI6, MI5, and GCHQ. And he was using delegates from this newspaper conference as the original spies for the British Empire. None of that's in their history. None of that's in any of those intelligence histories. They're starting to have to deal with it now because our research is becoming more and more public as more and more people circulate it. But I can say with every one of these things I'm mentioning, I have actual primary research that I can take to a court to prove these elements.
Michael, this is all fascinating, and it's going to be totally novel to our audience. I want to get some preliminary first impressions in reverse order, but first I want to clarify. When you talk about the British banks, you mean the Rothschild banking empire?
All of it, including the Rothschilds, is bigger than that.
And although they may have at one time talked about a white New World Order, it's very clear today it's a Jewish New World Order that's supposed to be governed out of Jerusalem. Would you agree to that?
I would have a different view of that. And what we have discovered, this whole Jewish issue is really fascinating, in that what I think we ought to be saying is Babylonian Radhanite. And these were the Jews of Babylon, who were the bankers of Babylon. But in fact, they called themselves Jews at the time. And this goes back to 600 BC and beyond. They were identified as Jews. But the fact is, in their bloodline, they were Turkish, they were Sogdian, they were Persian, and they were even Chinese.
Yes,
so what we're seeing, what we're calling Jews, my summary of that is what we're calling Jews today are largely not ethnic Jews.
Yes.
They're Babylonian.
I think here we would all agree to that. The problem is with public discourse, the term is used so commonly, it's very difficult to communicate successfully without indulging in imprecise language. Russ, I want your thoughts preliminary, and then Joaquin.
Winterwatch.net, I've got probably 5 or 6 major articles on this whole general topic, the Quigley gatekeeping he's talking about. The only nuance I would add to it is that Cecil Rhodes surrounded himself with homosexuals.
Right.
And,
of course.
And so there's where kind of the compromise starts, especially back in those days. You could really control homosexuals.
Through threats of blackmail or exposure, they could blackmail them.
Yeah,
it always goes back to the gays and the Jews.
Today it's a badge of distinction. You're supposed to be celebrated if you're gay. Go right ahead, Russ.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. And if you want to go, you can look up my articles. I can't remember a lot of them off the top of my head, but I would say that it was it was kind of a combination of Jews and these homosexuals that kind of put the thing together, and then how it morphed and where it is today. This is early history. Things just didn't arrive to today, 2024, just like that. It's an evolution.
Yeah,
so it's worth looking at.
This is a major reason why it's so.
It's so. To get to the point, it's 2024. It's now all Jews. Okay, I'll do that.
No, it's gays and Jews.
We're looking at some interesting history. We're looking at some interesting history that got gays and Jews, right?
Yeah, history that's unknown to the American people. I mean, as you say, even Quigley, suppresses it all. Joaquin, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that I recall that the Pilgrim Society, they wanted to resurrect the British Empire because it was already starting to fade into the sunset as America was becoming more dominant. So I remember that as part of the Cecil Rhodes objective of developing this baby of his. And I know that also I believe they have a society over here in America too.
They do,
Michael?
in New York.
Yeah, they do, don't they?
Yeah.
And it's basically the equivalent. It's almost like
They call
there's
it their
a
branch.
bar in America, and then the British have theirs.
They call the New York version their branch of the British Pilgrim Society.
Well, the American branch is really tied into the opium trade in China. And so if you go like Roosevelt, his ancestor was a big opium trader. That's where the money flowed out of. So they're kind of monopolists. It's creating monopoly, and particularly around vices and drugs. And so it's an early iteration of that. Right. And you look at John Kerry's mother's side, they're Brahmins. His father's side,
the Boston Brahmins.
His father's side was Jewish, but the Brahmin side were opium traders. That's what
in fact, they were using opium as a means of exchange in Boston. That's how the Boston banks got started.
Right. So what happens is that when you see these leaders emerge in modern times, they have a strange mix of these backgrounds, opium, and they usually be kind of mixed. There'll be a Brahmin family, a Protestant family, and a Jewish family intermarrying, and then pop, here comes John Kerry. Same with David Cameron. David Cameron's great-great-grandfathers financed the Russo-Japanese War. They were a monopolist. And one grandfather was a Jew, tied in with the Rothschild family, and the other guy was a Scotsman. So you get this very strange mix in this whole Pilgrim Society concept.
Joaquin,
I don't know if you've come across that. Have you come across that aspect?
Yes.
Joaquin, I know you want to add a few more words.
Well, there's also, the East India Tea Company. I believe they got their start around 1699, and they were a big part of the whole, Chinese heroin movement. There's these bloodline families that have been in control for many, many centuries now. And they go back, as Michael was saying, to basically the Babylonian time. They're direct descendants of the Babylonians, and they also come from. They say that the Khazarians or Khazar came from the Turkic nomadic tribes. So there's mixes of the East and the West in there. It's all very interesting. But
it really gets interesting. I'm sorry to jump in on this because this is kind of my topic, really.
Okay.
I've done a lot on this. What really gets interesting is not going back to Babylonians necessarily, but 4 generations back. And you start looking at the great-great-grandfathers of a lot of these characters, some of them that I've mentioned. That's where it really gets interesting. The Bush, they have a very interesting ancestry. And that's what ties into this whole Cecil Rhodes Jewish network, because it's mixed marriage. They formed an alliance.
Well, the interesting thing is that Rhodes himself was not Jewish, but going back to what Joaquin said about the heritage here, what we started looking at as a real organizing principle here was the history of usury. And that's what goes back to Babylon, into Hammurabi Code, because that was the first time that charging interest was codified in a country's laws. And what we've seen is that ever since then, people who call themselves Jews have controlled that in Babylon. But what we find is, even though the cuneiform records actually confirmed that these Jewish bankers were running the banks of Babylon, that was at the exact same time that the prophet Ezekiel was railing against usury. So there was a juxtaposition there of situations. And so what we started looking at was the history of the banking and commerce trade from Iceland to China and the Silk Road. And so what we see in 1066 is William the Conqueror took over England and it was the first one to unite all of the English duchy kingdoms. And what was one of the first things he did? He formed the City of London in a charter, which we can see today. And specifically, he said that the way we were going to pass the membership down in this charter was from father to son. There's the bloodline in our modern history.
Just for the audience who doesn't understand, the City of London is 1 square mile in the heart of London, where the bankers have their offices, where Muammar Gaddafi observed, if you want to end international terrorism, just lob a cruise missile into the City of London. Not the sprawling, massive City of London with all of its historic aspect, but this very concentration of wealth and power Michael is addressing. Please continue.